On the windswept plains of the Wyoming frontier, winter bites deep and survival is hard-earned. Alone in her remote cabin, a widow named Clara Reeves has spent years living in the shadow of her late husband's death. Little does she know, a group of ruthless bandits is about to make her life even harder, looking for a fight in a town they think is ripe for the taking. But Clara isn't just any widow. She's a gunslinger, a woman with a past as sharp and unforgiving as the snowstorms that rage around her cabin. When these bandits pick the wrong fight, they'll learn just how deadly the quiet widow really is. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The winter winds howled across the frozen plains of Wyoming, carrying with them the biting cold that seeped through even the thickest walls. The sun hung low in the sky, a pale disk that barely warmed the world below. The snow had been falling for hours, dusting the earth with a layer of white, turning the land into an endless stretch of quiet wilderness. Clara Reeves stood by the window of her small log cabin, watching the storm as it raged outside. She had grown accustomed to the isolation, the silence, and the cold. It had been nearly 3 years since her husband, Thomas, had died, his body swallowed up by the harsh winter in a mining accident. Since then, Clara had lived alone, eking out a modest existence on the land they had worked together. She had inherited his guns, his tools, and his legacy, but she had no one left to share it with. She wasn't afraid of the loneliness. It was part of the land, part of the life she had chosen. But tonight, something felt different. There was a restlessness in the air, a tension she couldn't shake. The storm outside was fierce, but it wasn't the wind or snow that had her on edge. It was the silence, the kind that only came before trouble. Clara turned away from the window and made her way to the small fireplace where the flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. She stirred the fire with the poker, her movements methodical, as if the rhythm of the task might ease the tightness in her chest. The wood crackled as the flames consumed it, sending sparks up the chimney. She glanced toward the door, her eyes narrowing as if she could sense something approaching. She didn't know what it was, but she had lived long enough on the frontier to trust her instincts. Her hand instinctively brushed the worn handle of her husband's revolver, which hung on the wall above the mantel. It was an old, heavy piece, the weight of it familiar in her grip. Thomas had given it to her for protection when they had first moved to Blackwood Ridge. It had become her companion after his death, her only connection to the man who had taught her to shoot, to survive. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something outside, a horse's hooves crunching through the snow. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't unusual for travelers to pass through, but in a storm this bad, it was rare for anyone to be out. She reached for her rifle, which rested on the table beside the fireplace, and moved toward the door. She cracked the door open just enough to peek out, her breath fogging up the glass. A silhouette appeared through the swirling snow, a lone rider making his way toward the cabin. The figure was tall, wrapped in a long coat, and riding a sturdy-looking horse. Clara's eyes narrowed as she watched the rider approach. There was something about his posture that made her uneasy. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping outside, pulling the door shut behind her. The cold air hit her like a slap in the face, but she was used to it. She squared her shoulders and stepped into the snow, her boots crunching loudly in the stillness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice strong, but her eyes never leaving the rider's form. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled his horse to a halt and looked down at her, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Clara's hand instinctively rested on the grip of her revolver, but she didn't draw it yet, not until she knew who he was. "I'm looking for shelter from the storm," the man finally called back, his voice low and gruff. Clara didn't trust it. She had learned long ago that anyone on this land was either desperate or dangerous. "I'm not in the habit of offering shelter to strangers," she said, her voice firm. "What's your business here?" The rider shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward the pocket of his coat. Clara's eyes flicked to the movement, her mind already calculating the distance, the angle, the quickest way to draw her gun. She wasn't foolish enough to let her guard down around someone who looked like trouble. "I've got a few friends looking for a warm place to stay, ma'am," the rider said, a grin creeping onto his lips. "We'd be much obliged if you could spare us a bit of hospitality." Clara's eyes hardened as she studied him. The tone in his voice, the way he lingered on the word friends, told her all she needed to know. This wasn't a simple traveler caught in the storm. This man was trouble, and trouble usually came in groups. Without another word, Clara turned back toward the door, her movements deliberate. She had a few moments before they would be close enough to make their move. Enough time to prepare. Inside, she grabbed the revolver from the wall, checking the chamber to make sure it was loaded. Her heart rate quickened slightly as she heard the sound of more hooves, this time, more than one rider. She had been right. The man outside wasn't alone. Clara's mind raced as she quickly moved to the back of the cabin. She had enough supplies to last a few weeks, but she wasn't about to be caught off guard. She had been on the frontier long enough to know that when trouble came, it came fast. And when bandits showed up, they didn't just want shelter, they wanted everything. As she checked the window, she saw the outlines of 3 more riders coming into view, their faces hidden by scarves and wide-brimmed hats. Clara's grip tightened on her revolver. She wasn't just going to give them what they wanted. These men were about to learn the hard way that the widow of Blackwood Ridge was not someone to be underestimated. The bandits had no idea who they were dealing with. The cold was biting, and the wind had picked up even more, swirling around Clara as she took her position by the back window. The snow was thick now, blurring the shapes of the riders as they neared her cabin, their horses' hooves cutting through the blanket of white like a warning bell. Clara could feel the tension building, a sharp edge settling into her gut. She had dealt with bandits before. They didn't scare her. But there was something different about this group, something dangerous. Her eyes flicked toward the front door, then back to the riders. There were 4 of them in total, each one wrapped in thick coats and scarves, their faces obscured. They had been smart enough to wait for the storm to cover their approach, but not smart enough to stay out of trouble. They were about to find out what it meant to mess with the wrong widow. Clara stepped back from the window, her movements deliberate and slow, careful not to make a sound. The last thing she wanted was to give herself away too early. She moved toward the front door, making sure the revolver was securely strapped to her waist and that her rifle was close at hand. Her mind was clear, the thoughts of the past few years fading into the background. She wasn't Clara Reeves, the widow. She was Clara Reeves, the gunslinger. And these men were about to regret stepping onto her land. She paused at the door, listening. The sounds of the riders had stopped. They were close now, too close. Clara's hand tightened around the doorknob, ready to face them head-on. But before she could open it, the knock came, a sharp rap that echoed in the quiet of the cabin. "Open up, ma'am." The voice was rough, heavy with the cold, but Clara could hear the edge of impatience in it. "We ain't got all day." Clara stood motionless for a moment, her pulse steady. She wasn't going to make it easy for them. She wasn't going to open the door and let them waltz right in. Without a word, Clara moved silently to the side window. She leaned out slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the riders. They were dismounted now, huddling around their horses, their backs turned toward her cabin. The one who had spoken was the closest to the door, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle, though he hadn't drawn it yet. Clara's mind raced, calculating. She had the advantage for now. They didn't know she was armed. They didn't know she had been watching them the whole time. She looked down at her revolver and her rifle, then out the window at the men. There were 3 of them, including the one who had knocked. The 4th was off to the side, keeping an eye out, likely waiting for the signal to move in. Clara took a deep breath and turned back toward the door. She wasn't going to let them think she was afraid. She wasn't going to make the mistake of letting them set the terms. She would make her move before they made theirs. She swung the door open suddenly, stepping out onto the porch with her revolver in hand, aimed low and steady. The first bandit, the one closest to the door, turned in surprise, his hand already halfway to his rifle. But Clara's gun was faster. Without hesitation, she fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the snow-covered land, louder than she expected. The bandit's hand jerked away from his rifle as he staggered back, blood blooming from the side of his chest. His body crumpled to the ground, his rifle hitting the snow with a dull thud. The other 3 men reacted in an instant, their hands reaching for their weapons, their eyes wide with shock and anger. But Clara was already moving. She sidestepped quickly, her body low and swift as she ducked behind the edge of the cabin, taking cover behind the wall. She didn't wait to see if they fired back. She already knew what they would do. They'd shoot, and they'd shoot to kill. They thought they could intimidate her. They thought they could overrun a lone woman with a revolver. They had no idea what she was capable of. Clara didn't waste time. She peeked around the corner of the cabin just enough to see the second bandit, one of the 2 remaining men, firing into the cabin, missing wildly in the swirling snow. His anger and confusion were palpable, but it made him reckless. Clara saw his face, saw the fire in his eyes, and she took her shot. It was quick, a single pull of the trigger. The second man dropped without a sound, his body collapsing into the snow, blood staining the whiteness beneath him. The third man, the one who had been looking out for trouble, spun around, his rifle aimed right at Clara's last position. His eyes widened as he realized what had just happened. Clara didn't wait. She fired again. The man flinched as the bullet slammed into his side. He stumbled, half falling to the ground, clutching his wound. He didn't get back up. Clara moved swiftly, her revolver still in her hand, watching the fourth bandit, a man who had yet to make a move, scramble for his rifle. But it was too late. Clara raised her rifle this time. With a steady hand, she aimed, her eyes narrowing. The shot rang out, and the final bandit fell in a heap. His body splayed out in the snow like the others. The battlefield was silent now. The only sound was the howling wind, the cold biting the air, and Clara's breath as she lowered her rifle. She didn't feel anything at first. No joy, no sorrow, just a steady calm. This was the life she had chosen. This was the price of survival. Clara took a moment, letting the quiet settle in. She knew there would be more trouble that would come, more men who would try to take her land, her life. But for now, it was over. The bandits had underestimated her, and that mistake would cost them their lives. As she walked toward the bodies of the fallen men, Clara reached down to take their weapons, rifles, knives, anything she could use. She didn't waste time. They weren't coming back. The land was cold, and the storm was far from over. But for tonight, Clara Reeves had reminded the frontier that no one, not even a band of bandits, could take what was hers. The snow continued to fall heavily, blanketing the ground in a deep, silent whiteness, hiding the tracks of the 4 bandits as if the land itself was trying to forget what had just happened. Clara Reeves stood over the bodies of the men, her breath rising in soft clouds as she surveyed the scene. It wasn't the first time she had taken a life, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She had lived this way for years, long before she had buried Thomas. She had learned quickly that the frontier didn't care about who you were or how you felt about taking a life. It was about survival, plain and simple. Those men had come to take from her, to violate her sanctuary, and she had made sure they paid for it. Clara knelt down, inspecting the bodies, taking their guns and any other tools of value they carried. She didn't take pleasure in it, but she wasn't going to let any part of it go to waste. The revolver in her hand was a piece of her past, her husband's legacy, and it was the only thing she trusted. It had kept her alive all these years, and today, it had kept her safe. Once she had collected everything of value, she turned toward the cabin, the doors still open behind her, the warmth of the fire calling her back inside. She moved swiftly, not letting herself linger. Time was always against her out here. The wind howled as if demanding that she face it. As she entered the cabin, Clara bolted the door behind her, securing it against the storm. She dropped the rifles and ammunition on the table and moved to the window, her eyes scanning the snow-covered ground. The wind howled, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It was a feeling that had plagued her for the past few hours, like the storm outside had somehow dragged with it a sense of dread. She knew that bandits weren't the only threat out here. The men she had just dispatched might be a small part of a larger group, and though she had dealt with them swiftly, she wasn't foolish enough to believe they hadn't sent a signal. Clara knew she had to act fast. She paced the cabin, checking the fire, making sure the extra rounds of ammunition were within easy reach, and ensuring the knives were where they belonged. Her thoughts returned to the bandits outside. There were 4 of them. The group they belonged to had to be sizable enough to send men on a reconnaissance mission to hunt down someone alone in the wilds like her. Clara had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her to be ready. The door groaned again, and Clara immediately reached for her rifle, her heart leaping into her throat. Someone was testing the door. She stood quiet as a mouse, her breath held tight in her chest, waiting. Whoever it was cautious, just like she would be if the roles were reversed. There was no way they knew she had already dealt with their comrades. Then came the knock. Soft, almost a tap, a careful sound, meant to test if anyone was home. Clara's finger was already on the rifle trigger as she stood motionless, her back pressed to the wall next to the door. She couldn't see who was there, but she didn't need to. She was used to the game, the kind where both sides were waiting for the other to make the first move. Her heart was steady. She had been in this position before, and it always came down to one thing: who would pull the trigger first? "Ma'am," a voice called from outside. It was a man's voice, rough from the cold, but Clara recognized the underlying tone, a mixture of politeness and calculation. He was trying to draw her out, make her think it was just another traveler stranded by the storm. But Clara wasn't fooled. "I know you're in there," the man continued, his voice a little louder, as if to prove he wasn't intimidated. "We're not here to cause trouble, just need a little shelter from the storm." Clara didn't respond. She let the silence stretch, her rifle aimed at the door. The longer she waited, the more the tension in her chest wound tighter, the anticipation curling inside her. The storm outside had taken on a new sound now, the low rumble of distant thunder, a reminder that nature was just as ruthless as the men who came to rob and kill. Another tap on the door, and Clara finally broke her silence. "You're wasting your time," she called through the thick wooden door, her voice carrying the cool, sharp edge of someone who had been here too long. "Get lost." For a moment, there was silence on the other side. Then, the man spoke again, his voice lower, colder now. "You don't know who you're dealing with, lady. You think you can just kill our men and get away with it?" Clara felt a sharpness pierce through her chest, not from the words themselves, but from the weight they carried. She knew what this meant now. The group was larger than she had anticipated. And worse, they weren't just looking for shelter. They were here for revenge. "Maybe I do know," Clara replied, her voice steady, her eyes narrowed in cold focus. "Maybe I know exactly who you are and who sent you, but I'm not interested in talking. I'm interested in surviving." She heard a shift on the other side of the door, a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her heart race. The man wasn't done. He was waiting for something, looking for a weakness. The air seemed to freeze around her, as if everything outside the cabin had gone still, waiting for the next move. Clara didn't wait. She opened the door just a crack, enough to see the shape of the man standing in front of her. He was tall, rugged, dressed in layers to combat the cold. He looked rough, worn from traveling, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of malice mixed with calculation, and there was the unmistakable mark of confidence on his face. He wasn't just any bandit. This man had power, and he had people with him. And now they knew exactly where she was. Clara's hand didn't waver. Her revolver was ready. "I'll ask again," the man said, his hand inching toward his belt. "Are you going to open that door, or do we make you?" Clara's finger moved toward the trigger. She had no intention of waiting any longer. It was time to send a message. "Make me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes locked on his with unflinching resolve. Before the man could react, the door swung open fully. Clara raised her revolver, aimed, and fired. The shot rang out with a deafening crack, splitting the heavy silence of the storm outside. The bandit's hand jerked back, his body jerking violently as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He let out a muffled shout of pain, staggering back, and Clara didn't wait for him to recover. She stepped into the open doorway, the rifle raised now. Her eyes locked onto the man as he clutched his bleeding shoulder, stumbling back toward the snow. "Get off my land," Clara called, her voice cold, unyielding. The fire in her chest was steady now, fueled by the adrenaline of the moment. She wasn't going to let this man, or his friends, get any closer. The bandit's face twisted in pain and shock as he reached for the rifle at his side, but Clara was faster. She squeezed the trigger once more, the rifle kicking in her hands. The bullet struck the man in the leg, sending him sprawling into the snow with a grunt of agony. He didn't have the strength to rise this time. His rifle fell uselessly to the ground as he groaned, clutching his leg, eyes wide with fear as he looked up at Clara, who was standing tall in the doorway, the barrel of her rifle steady in her hands. "Please," he gasped, his voice thick with pain and fear. "Don't kill me. I didn't mean no harm. Just looking for shelter." Clara's eyes narrowed, her lips tight. She had heard this story before, pleading bandits who thought they could soften her up with a few kind words. But there was no mercy in her now. Not for him, not for any of them. "Shelter," Clara spat, disgust creeping into her voice. "You and your crew are looking for shelter. Or maybe you're just looking for something to steal. I've seen enough of your kind to know when a man's begging for his life." The bandit flinched as she spoke, his hands raised in surrender, but Clara didn't lower her rifle. She knew better than to give them a chance to regroup, to make another move. These men weren't looking for shelter. They were looking for a fight. "Where are the others?" she asked, her eyes scanning the snow, watching for movement, listening for the sounds of the other bandits closing in. The man's face paled as he glanced toward the cabin, his breath shallow as the cold crept into his bones. "They back in the trees. I don't know how many, ma'am. I didn't know you was a sharpshooter. I thought." Clara raised her rifle slightly, narrowing her eyes as she took in his words. He thought he could walk away from this. They all thought they could outsmart a widow living alone in the wilderness. But Clara was no fool, and she had no patience for these kinds of games. "I'll ask you once more," Clara said, her voice cold steel. "Where are the rest of your men?" The bandit swallowed hard, his chest heaving as he struggled to speak. "There, by the trees. We came to see if you had anything worth taking. We didn't mean no harm. Just need food. Please." Clara didn't respond immediately. Her gaze flickered back to the trees, her mind calculating. There had to be at least 2 more men waiting in the woods. And from the sound of it, they were likely hoping to take her by surprise. "You think I'm going to just let you walk away?" Clara asked, her voice a low growl. The bandit's eyes shifted nervously, and for the first time, he seemed to realize just how wrong he'd been. "Ma'am, please. I'm just a scout. My friends." Clara didn't let him finish. Her instincts had kicked in, her sense of danger sharp. She turned, her boots crunching in the snow as she made her way around the side of the cabin, keeping her rifle at the ready. As she moved, Clara's eyes darted between the trees. The storm had been kind enough to give her a little cover, but the bandits would be expecting it to work in their favor too. She couldn't let them get too close. She needed to end this before things escalated. The wind whipped against her face as she crouched low, taking cover behind the cabin. She peered around the corner, just in time to catch a glimpse of movement through the trees. 2 men, walking cautiously toward the cabin. They were unaware of her position, but Clara's eyes were already calculating their every move. She waited, watching them as they moved closer. They were talking low to each other, their voices muffled by the storm. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she could see the way they moved. Slow, deliberate, as if they were confident they had the advantage. But they had no idea they were walking straight into a trap. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was calm. This was what she had trained for, the countless hours she had spent learning how to read a situation, how to move without being seen, how to take down an enemy before they even knew they were in danger. Clara waited for them to get closer, close enough that they couldn't retreat without running right into her line of fire. When the first man took a step forward, Clara squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, the sound loud and crisp in the otherwise quiet, snow-covered world. The man fell instantly, his body jerking as the bullet hit him square in the chest. He didn't make a sound as he crumpled to the ground. His companion didn't even have time to react before Clara fired again. The second man, spinning toward her, barely had time to raise his rifle before her bullet found its mark in his stomach. He gasped as the wind left his body, staggering backward before collapsing into the snow. Clara didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, walking toward the fallen men, her rifle still at the ready. She wasn't sure if there were any more of them still lurking in the trees, but she wasn't about to let down her guard. These men were ruthless, and if they were still breathing, they were still a threat. She stood over the bodies, her breath steady, the cold creeping into her bones, but she didn't feel it. All that mattered was the work, getting the job done, and the job wasn't finished yet. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the sting of the cold, but Clara didn't flinch. She'd been through worse. The two men she had just taken down lay still in the snow, their bodies crumpled and lifeless, their rifles discarded a few feet away. She didn't take any pleasure in it, but she wasn't about to let them think they could intimidate her. Not after everything she had already fought for. She stepped away from the bodies, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, her rifle still at the ready. The storm had settled in around her, thick with snow and the whisper of the wind, as if nature itself was holding its breath. But Clara couldn't afford to take it easy. She knew this wasn't over yet. The bandits had sent scouts ahead. There was more coming. They weren't done. She moved swiftly back toward the cabin, her steps silent as she slid around the corner, just out of view of the window. Her hand gripped the door handle once again, and she gently pushed the door open, stepping inside with her rifle now in her arms. She hadn't felt the fear in the pit of her stomach for years, but now, standing in the quiet warmth of her cabin, it returned. Only this time, it wasn't her own fear. It was the cold realization that she was outnumbered. The fire in the hearth crackled, the flames casting dancing shadows across the cabin. The warmth, the faint smell of burning pine, were a comfort that was quickly fading. Clara needed a plan. She needed to deal with the rest of them before they regrouped, before they got too close. She turned toward the window again, peering through the thick curtains, watching the horizon where the storm blurred everything together. The snow outside was beginning to intensify, thickening into a blinding whiteout, but that wouldn't help her. The bandits would push through the storm eventually, like they had before. The only thing Clara could rely on now was her skills, and the few supplies she had left. Clara took a deep breath, the weight of the rifle solid in her hands. She checked her revolver, quickly counting the remaining rounds, her thoughts clear and focused. She had enough. Enough for one last push. Enough to take down whatever was left of the bandits. Then, she heard it. A faint noise, barely audible above the storm, but unmistakable. The crunch of boots in the snow, moving slowly but steadily toward the cabin. Clara stiffened, her instincts flaring. They were here, and they weren't going to wait for her to make the first move. She was sure of it. She moved quickly, dropping to a crouch and peering out the window once more. There, through the snow, she could make out the faint shape of another rider. This one much slower, as though being careful not to make too much noise. The figure was alone, but Clara wasn't so sure it was one of the same men. No, this one was different. A larger build, more deliberate in their movements. She couldn't quite make out the details, but the way the person moved gave her the impression they were in charge. This was no ordinary bandit. Her pulse quickened. She needed to decide quickly. They were close, too close for comfort, and they likely knew something was wrong when they hadn't heard from their comrades. But Clara knew better than to underestimate anyone who had the nerve to step onto her land. She reached for her revolver and her rifle, checking the chamber once more. There wasn't time to waste. The door was still slightly ajar, just enough to allow her a clear line of sight. As she crouched there, in the corner of her cabin, the door creaked open just enough to reveal a figure standing in the snow. It was a tall man, dark, with a broad-brimmed hat low over his face. His coat was long, heavy against the snow, and he didn't make a move to draw his gun. But Clara saw his eyes, sharp, alert, and scanning the cabin, looking for her. His hand rested on the handle of his pistol, but he didn't draw it yet. He was waiting. Clara stayed perfectly still, watching. Her body was a coil of tension, every muscle in her body ready to spring. She wasn't afraid, but she knew this man wasn't just another bandit. This was a leader, and a leader meant trouble. "Come out, lady," the man called, his voice low and gruff, barely audible over the storm. "We don't need no trouble." Just come out and we'll make this easy." Clara didn't answer right away. Her mind raced, weighing her options. She wasn't afraid of this man, but she wasn't going to rush in without knowing more. He didn't know she'd already taken down 2 of his men. He didn't know she was ready, but she wasn't about to show her hand. "Easy," she called back, her voice calm and steady, though it was laced with contempt. "You and your crew think you can waltz onto my land and make demands?" There was a pause, and for a moment, Clara thought he might answer. But then, he just shook his head, a smirk pulling at his lips beneath the shadow of his hat. "Didn't know you had such fire, ma'am. Guess that's why we didn't think twice about coming up here. But it looks like we've made a mistake." Clara's heart pounded. He was mocking her, playing with her, but she wasn't interested in games. "Not now. You've made more than one mistake," Clara said, her voice colder now. "But the biggest one was thinking you could take what isn't yours." The man took a step forward, his hand moving closer to his gun. It was now or never. Clara could feel the surge of adrenaline rushing through her veins. She took a steady breath, raised her rifle, and took aim. Before the man could draw, Clara fired. The rifle shot rang out, the sharp crack of gunfire slicing through the heavy snow. The man in the doorway jerked backward, his body staggering as the bullet struck him in the shoulder. The force of the shot knocked him off balance, and he stumbled back into the snow with a grunt of pain. Clara didn't wait. She moved quickly, stepping out from behind the corner of the cabin, the rifle still in her hands, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. She couldn't afford to hesitate, couldn't give this man or his men any room to regroup. The leader was down, but that didn't mean they were all gone. The man groaned in the snow, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck. He tried to rise, but his face was twisted with pain, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Clara's heart beat steadily, the calmness she had cultivated over the years settling over her like a cold blanket. She had done this before, and she was going to do it again. "Stay down," Clara said coldly, her voice firm. Her revolver was still at her waist, her rifle resting on her shoulder. She didn't need to repeat herself. She had dealt with enough men like him to know they would listen when they saw the certainty in her eyes. The man's eyes widened in disbelief, but there was a flicker of recognition. The realization that he had made a mistake was written across his face. He could see it now. This woman, alone in the wilderness, wasn't just some helpless widow. She was a fighter, a gunslinger. "I didn't think you had the stones," he spat, his voice thick with pain and frustration. Clara didn't flinch. She had heard every excuse before, every desperate plea. This wasn't about stones or bravery. This was about survival. "You came looking for trouble," Clara replied, her voice steady, unwavering. "And now you've found it." The man grunted, shifting in the snow, his hand still clutching his shoulder as he glared up at her. Clara's grip on her rifle tightened, but she didn't fire. She had already made her point. "You don't have to die today," Clara said, her voice calm, but with a quiet edge. "Tell me where the rest of your men are, and I'll let you go." The man sneered, though it was a grimace more than a smile. "You think I'm going to tell you anything?" he growled, his voice strained from the pain. "You're just a woman. You can't handle what's coming next. We're going to burn this place to the ground." Clara's eyes hardened, and without a second thought, she fired again. This time missing deliberately, the bullet striking just inches from his leg, embedding into the snow with a thud. The man's eyes widened, his breath catching. "You." "I'm not asking twice," Clara interrupted, her voice as cold as the winter wind. "Where are they?" He hesitated, fear flashing across his face. Clara could see the shift in his eyes, the flicker of calculation as the reality of his situation set in. But Clara wasn't done. "If you don't tell me," Clara said softly, stepping closer now, "I won't kill you. But your friends, the ones still out there, they won't be so lucky." The man's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He knew he was cornered, and Clara wasn't about to give him the chance to talk his way out of it. She could see it, the same fear that any man would show when they realized they were no longer in control. I'll tell you," he stammered, the words spilling out. "They're at the ridge to the east. There's 6 of 'em. They're waiting for the signal. But you ain't gonna stop 'em. We're coming back, widow." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving him. Good. Now go. The man's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't make a move. He knew better than to challenge her again. Instead, he spat on the ground, his chest heaving with effort as he pushed himself up, the pain from his wound making him falter. Clara didn't lower her rifle until he had turned, limping away, leaving the snow stained with his blood. She watched him go, making sure he was really retreating before she turned toward the cabin. The tension in her chest started to ease, but the momentary relief didn't last. She knew the battle wasn't over. The other men would come, and when they did, she would have to face them. She had no doubt they'd be even more determined after seeing what had happened to their leader. Inside the cabin, Clara bolted the door again, her mind already moving into the next phase of her plan. She needed to prepare. She had a little time before they would arrive, and she had to make it count. The bandits hadn't expected her to be prepared, but she had been living on Blackwood Ridge for years, and she knew exactly how to handle men like them. She checked her ammunition, laid out her other firearms, and gathered her supplies. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, Clara was calm. She was used to the noise of the storm. She was used to the cold. It had become part of her world. But the men outside wouldn't know that. They wouldn't know the woman they were about to face wasn't just some widow. She was a force in her own right. A woman who had lived through too much to let anyone take her land, her life, without a fight. Her hand brushed over the worn handle of her revolver as she turned toward the window, peering out through the snow, waiting for them to make their move. Clara had faced down tougher men before. She wasn't about to let a bunch of bandits change that now. The wind howled outside, the storm growing in strength, as though nature itself was a force bent on pushing the land toward its breaking point. Clara stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The snow was so thick now that it made everything look like a white blur. Her breath fogged up the glass, but her eyes remained clear, focused. She could feel the calmness in her chest, but the tension was there too, coiling tighter as she thought about the men out there. The ones who were coming for her. The man she had shot earlier, the one who had survived, wouldn't get far. He might be limping back to his group, telling them how a lone woman had picked off 2 of his men with ease. But they were a band of bandits. They didn't care about such things. They'd be out for revenge, and revenge was a dangerous thing to underestimate. Clara took a deep breath and stepped away from the window, moving quickly across the cabin to check the door, the barricades. She had everything in place. Her rifle was loaded, her revolvers close at hand, and her mind was as sharp as it had ever been. It didn't matter how many there were. It didn't matter that they thought she was just some widow. Clara Reeves was a gunslinger, and she'd make sure they knew it before the night was over. She had dealt with worse. The last time bandits had come after her, they had made the same mistake, underestimating her. And like always, it cost them. But the storm outside made her uneasy. There was something about it. The wind, the snow. It was as if the world was holding its breath. A shadow moved outside her cabin, just beyond the edge of her sight. Clara froze, her hand going to her revolver. She was prepared. The question was, how many were there? How many had survived the snow, the wind, the cold? The sound of heavy footsteps reached her ears, and then a voice. A familiar one. It was low, a deep rumble that made Clara's blood run cold. "You might want to come out, ma'am," the voice called, muffled by the storm. "We ain't got all day. And your friends, well, they ain't gonna make it." Clara's jaw tightened. The leader, the one she had shot in the shoulder. She didn't answer. Instead, she waited. Her hand on the handle of her revolver, she positioned herself by the side of the door. She didn't need to see him to know what he was doing. He was trying to get a rise out of her, trying to make her show herself, and that was exactly what he wanted. But Clara wasn't going to fall for that. The door creaked slowly as it shifted with the wind, and she could hear his breathing outside, steady, as though he was trying to calculate his next move. Clara stepped back, silently moving toward the back of the cabin. The storm outside masked the sound of her boots against the wooden floor, and she used that to her advantage. She'd learned long ago that when it came to dealing with bandits, you had to be a step ahead. Always. The voice outside called out again, this time with a little more urgency. "Don't make me come in after you, lady. You might be a good shot, but we're more than you think. You can't keep running from us." Clara didn't even flinch. She knew what they were trying to do. They wanted her to panic, to make a mistake. But there was no mistake. Not now. She had already taken down 3 of them. The leader? He was next. She took a steadying breath, peering out the back window. Through the snow and swirling wind, she could just make out the figures of 2 men moving closer to the cabin. They weren't being cautious anymore. They were confident. Too confident. Clara's grip tightened on the rifle. There were 4 of them. That was the last thing she needed to know. And there was no more waiting. She didn't need to wait for them to get any closer. She had a plan. With a quick motion, Clara ducked out the back door, her boots crunching in the snow. She was fast, moving low, staying out of their line of sight as much as possible. The wind roared around her, almost as if it was helping her. The snow was thick enough now to cover her tracks, but the bandits would still know something wasn't right. She moved quickly to the left side of the cabin, staying in the cover of the trees. She couldn't see the 2 men who were approaching from the front, but she knew they'd come around the side at any moment. She took her rifle in both hands, her heart steady as she crouched low, waiting. Her eyes flickered to the left, catching the shape of the 2 men as they rounded the cabin, their feet crunching in the snow, their rifles drawn. Clara didn't hesitate. She aimed quickly and fired. The first man dropped immediately, his rifle falling from his hands as he crumpled into the snow. The second man, surprised by the sudden attack, barely had time to raise his weapon before Clara's second shot hit him in the chest. He fell backward with a thud, his rifle tumbling uselessly in the snow. Her heart raced now, the adrenaline surging through her as she heard the other 2 bandits moving closer. There was no time to savor the victory. The leader was still out there, and Clara needed to finish this. Quickly, she rose from her crouch, her revolver already in hand. She didn't wait for them to make the first move this time. She was done playing games. As the remaining 2 bandits appeared around the corner of the cabin, Clara fired first. The shot rang out, striking the leader square in the chest. His eyes widened, and he staggered back, shock written across his face. But Clara didn't give him time to recover. She fired again, hitting the other bandit in the shoulder, sending him sprawling into the snow. The leader gasped for breath, his hand clutching the wound, but Clara was already moving toward him, her revolver aimed straight at his heart. "You should have left when you had the chance," Clara said, her voice steady but cold. The leader's eyes flickered with recognition, his lips twitching as he tried to find the words. But it was too late. Clara squeezed the trigger. The final shot echoed through the snow. The snow fell in thick sheets, swirling around Clara's figure like the end of a storm. The world around her was silent for a moment, save for the whistling wind and the crackle of the distant fire inside her cabin. For men, all dead, lay in the snow, their bodies sprawled across the ground, their rifles scattered beside them like forgotten toys. The snow would eventually claim them, cover their tracks, hide the evidence of what had happened. But Clara knew better than to let that be the end of the story. The leader, the man who had taunted her earlier, lay with his face twisted in a grimace, his blood staining the snow. Clara's breath came in even, controlled puffs as she surveyed the area, her revolver still in her hand, her finger hovering over the trigger just in case. The storm had masked the sounds of their approach, but now there was nothing left but the aftermath, the kind of silence that only followed a fight. Clara felt it, the weight of the moment. It wasn't just the bandits she had to worry about. It was the realization that this battle, this moment, was a reflection of everything the frontier had taught her. It was always a fight for survival. You either killed, or you were killed. There was no room for hesitation. And Clara had learned long ago how to deal with people who tried to take what wasn't theirs. Her boots crunched in the snow as she moved toward the men, one step at a time, her eyes still alert. She had no illusions. This wasn't a victory. Not yet. She hadn't seen the last of the trouble. They were ruthless, and they would be back. The men who had been sent out today might be gone, but there were always others waiting to replace them. Clara knelt down beside the bodies, her hand brushing over the leader's coat. She knew that whatever was left of the gang, they would come looking for their fallen comrades. They would want revenge. And Clara wasn't foolish enough to think they'd leave her be. She needed to be ready. The fire from the cabin crackled in the distance, its warmth now a stark contrast to the cold outside. Clara moved back to the cabin's entrance, making sure to lock the door behind her, her hand resting on the worn wood. She was used to the isolation, but now, with 4 dead men lying outside her cabin, the solitude seemed heavier than usual. Inside, she began to clean her weapons, methodically checking them, making sure they were in working order. The scent of burning wood filled the cabin, and for a moment, Clara allowed herself to relax, even if just for a breath. She was no stranger to danger. She had learned the hard way that this life, this way of living, was fraught with it. But today she had made it through. And in this world, that was all she could ask for. But just as she settled, a faint sound outside caught her attention. A snap of twigs breaking underfoot. Clara's senses sharpened immediately. She wasn't alone. Again, her hand moved to her revolver without a second thought, her heart steady but her mind racing. The snowstorm still howled outside, the blinding white covering any movement, any attempt to see who might be creeping up on her. Her cabin, small and remote as it was, still had its advantages. But she couldn't afford to let her guard down. She took a steadying breath and moved toward the window, slowly, carefully. She didn't want to reveal herself, but she had to know what was happening. She peered through the frosted glass, her breath fogging up the small window as she scanned the snowdrifts beyond. A figure was moving just outside her cabin, their outline barely visible against the whiteness of the snow. Clara's grip tightened on the handle of her revolver, but she didn't move yet. It could be anyone, just another traveler caught in the storm. She had to be sure. The figure paused, then moved closer to the cabin, crouching low, staying out of the light from the windows. Clara didn't breathe. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on every detail, every shift of the figure's body. This wasn't just a lost traveler. It was deliberate. A scout, someone who was either looking for trouble or trying to find out if she was still alive. Clara could hear their breath now, shallow and quiet. She waited. The seconds felt like hours. Her mind raced, and she adjusted her stance, preparing herself for whatever came next. If they came through that door, there would be no hesitation. She was done waiting. Suddenly, a low voice pierced the quiet of the storm. "Ma'am, we know you're in there." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It was one of the bandits, and this time, he wasn't alone. More had arrived. She could feel it in her bones. "We got a few more with us this time," the voice continued, the tone laced with a quiet threat. "We're not leaving without what we came for." Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. They thought they were in control, but Clara knew better than to let them think they had the upper hand. She reached for her rifle, her hand steady as she loaded the weapon. She had dealt with men like these before. She knew how to handle them. The voice called out again, this time with a more insistent tone. "You better come out, lady. You don't want this to get messy." Clara's lips curled into a cold, determined smile. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of surrender. This was her land, her life, and it was time for them to learn exactly who they were dealing with. She moved toward the door, her boots silent against the cabin floor, her rifle ready in her hands. The wind howled outside, but Clara was calm. Calm in the way only a person who had faced death 1,000 times could be. She stepped out onto the porch, her rifle aimed at the first figure she could see, silhouetted by the whiteout of the storm. They had no idea what they had just walked into. Clara stood on the porch, her eyes locked on the figure that had dared approach her cabin. The snow swirled in thick gusts, but she could see enough to know she had them right where she wanted them. The figure had his back to her, unaware of her presence. The wind had muffled the sound of her approach, giving her the advantage. His companions were still hidden somewhere, just beyond the blurring white of the storm, and Clara could feel them closing in. "You've made a big mistake," Clara said, her voice low and unwavering. The rifle in her hands was steady, aimed directly at the man, but she didn't pull the trigger just yet. She wanted him to know who he was dealing with first. The man froze at the sound of her voice, his head jerking up to look in her direction. He was tall, rugged, his face partially covered by a scarf, but his eyes widened as soon as they locked onto Clara. She could see the realization flash across his face, a mix of shock and anger. "You," he started, his voice wavering for the briefest of moments. Then he regained composure, shifting into a more defiant stance. "You're the one who took out Curtis and the others." Clara didn't respond. She wasn't here to make small talk. The man slowly shifted his hand toward his belt, likely reaching for a weapon, but Clara was faster. The sound of her rifle crackling through the storm was sharp, and the bullet lodged into the snow just inches from his boots, sending up a spray of white. "I told you to stop," Clara said, her voice now colder, firmer, her aim never wavering. "You're in my land. You made a mistake coming here." The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously toward the tree line. Clara could feel the tension rising, and she knew what he was thinking. He had backup. He wasn't going to let her shoot him without a fight. "Damn it," the man muttered under his breath, taking a cautious step back, his eyes never leaving her. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But this ain't over." Clara's lips curled into a thin smile. "No, it's not. But it will be for you." She didn't wait for him to draw his weapon. Before the man could make his next move, Clara fired again. The shot rang out with precision, striking the man square in the shoulder. He let out a strangled cry of pain as he dropped to his knees, clutching at his wound. Clara didn't take her eyes off him, her rifle still raised, ready to fire again if needed. The man gasped, struggling to breathe through the pain, but Clara remained calm. She had seen men like him fall before. She knew exactly how this was going to play out. "Tell me where the rest of your crew is," she said, her voice cold. "You tell me, and I'll make sure you don't suffer." The man's eyes flickered, his lips curling in frustration, but he didn't speak right away. Clara's patience was razor thin, but she didn't rush him. She let him stew in the silence, let him feel the weight of the rifle in her hands. She wasn't afraid of a fight, but she didn't want to kill him unless she had to. "You think we're done here?" The man spat, blood trickling down his chin. "You think I'm going to tell you anything after you just—" Clara shot him a look that silenced him instantly. "Tell me, or I'll make you wish you had. The others aren't far off, are they?" The man gritted his teeth, his hand still clutching at his shoulder as he struggled to stay upright. Clara was right. He could feel the blood seeping from his wound, and the cold was only making it worse. He knew he wasn't getting out of this easily, but there was a small part of him that still hoped he could make it out alive. His men would come. They always came. "They're up ahead," he said through gritted teeth, his voice thick with pain. "A few more, about 5 or 6. They're waiting by the ridge, just past the trees." Clara's grip on the rifle tightened, her eyes narrowing. That was exactly what she needed to hear. She had no time to waste. She had already put down 3 of them, but there were still more waiting for her, and she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of taking her down. "Thanks for the information," Clara said, her tone suddenly lighter, almost mockingly sweet. She raised her rifle, aimed, and before he could react, fired a final shot, the bullet finding its mark in the bandit's chest. The man's eyes widened in shock before his body slumped to the ground, lifeless, the blood quickly soaking into the snow around him. Clara didn't flinch as she watched the body fall, the man's struggles ending with a final gasp of air. She didn't take any pleasure in it, but she had no time for mercy now. She moved quickly, her steps silent as she retreated back toward the cabin. The others were out there, and they would come looking for their fallen comrades. Clara didn't plan to give them the opportunity. She grabbed her coat and her pack, loading up with more ammunition and supplies from the cabin. The fire was burning low, but she didn't linger. Every second counted now. The bandits would be angry, and they would come for her with everything they had. Clara stepped outside again, pulling the door closed behind her and securing it tightly. She moved quickly, the wind whipping at her face, as she made her way toward the ridge. She wasn't going to wait for them to come to her. She was going to take the fight to them. As she approached the trees, the world around her seemed to quiet down, the storm muffling the sounds of her footsteps. Clara crouched low, taking cover behind the trees as she scanned the ridge. She could just make out the shadows of men moving in the distance, their forms barely visible against the blinding snow. She didn't hesitate. The bandits were out in the open now, vulnerable, unaware of the deadly woman who was about to make sure they didn't get a second chance. Clara took a deep breath, her heart steady as she aimed her rifle at the closest figure. The storm raged around her, but all she could hear was the steady thud of her heart in her chest. And then, she fired. The shot rang out, cutting through the wind and snow like the crack of thunder. The first bandit, his silhouette barely visible against the swirling storm, dropped instantly. His body twisted with a jerking motion, the sound of his rifle hitting the snow muffled by the storm. Clara didn't pause to watch the fall. She had trained herself not to, knowing that the next target could be aiming right for her. She pulled back immediately, staying low and shifting behind a tree. Her heart was steady, her body a coiled spring as she waited. The other bandits hadn't yet realized what had happened. The first man had been the easiest shot. The others would be more cautious, and she didn't want to give them a chance to regroup. Clara knew their routine. She had seen it in countless gunfights over the years. When one of the crew dropped, the rest would hesitate. They'd scatter, try to find cover, assess the situation. It wasn't about skill, it was about confidence. And when that confidence was shattered, they didn't know how to react. Clara could already see the silhouettes of two more men moving toward the fallen body, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. They didn't look like soldiers or experienced fighters. They looked like men who'd gotten in over their heads, like most bandits did in the end. She couldn't let them regroup. Not this time. She checked her position. The ridge ahead of her was still visible through the falling snow, but it wasn't far enough for them to think she was out of range. Clara took another slow, controlled breath, carefully positioning herself behind the trees to line up another shot. Through the whirling snowflakes, she saw them clearly now, the two remaining bandits. They were talking, probably arguing about what to do next. But Clara didn't need to hear them. She already knew. They were trying to get their bearings, trying to figure out how they'd let one of their own drop so easily. It was only a matter of time before they realized the rest of their group wasn't coming back. She took aim at the nearest one, her fingers steady on the rifle's trigger. She wouldn't miss. Clara fired again, this time a little more calculated, and the second bandit dropped like a ragdoll, his body tumbling to the side. A muffled cry of surprise escaped his lips, but the storm seemed to swallow it whole. The remaining bandit, the one who had been further behind, spun around in alarm, his rifle coming up in defense. But Clara was already moving. She didn't waste time. With precision, she adjusted her aim and fired her last shot. The final bandit's head snapped back, and he crumpled forward in the snow, his rifle falling from his hand as his body slumped lifelessly to the ground. There was no sound except for the wind and Clara's heart, still pounding with the weight of the moment. It was done. All around her, the storm raged on, the only sign of the fight left behind in the blood-stained snow and the still bodies of the men who had underestimated her. Clara stood there for a moment, her rifle resting by her side. She hadn't even broken a sweat. It was over, just like that. No more bandits. No more trouble. For now. But she didn't let herself relax. Not yet. Clara moved quickly, walking through the snow toward the fallen men, her boots sinking into the drifts with each step. She checked each body, confirming what she already knew. They weren't getting up. Not this time. The bandits had been foolish to come here. They had thought her alone, unprepared. But Clara was no fool. She had spent years alone in the wilderness, adapting to its dangers. She had learned how to survive. She had learned how to kill when she needed to. But as Clara knelt beside the last bandit, her mind didn't linger on the violence. She couldn't afford to. The storm still howled around her, but there was something more pressing to focus on. She had done what needed to be done, but the danger wasn't over. The group they had come from wasn't far behind. Clara wiped the snow off her gloves and glanced around. The wind had picked up again, sending the snowflakes swirling in a blur, but in the distance, Clara thought she saw another figure, faint against the horizon. More had come, no doubt. She had to move quickly before they could mount any kind of retaliation. But before she made a decision, Clara stood, taking a moment to look back toward the cabin. She was alone in this fight, just as she had always been. The quiet widow of Blackwood Ridge was more than a name. She was a survivor, and she had just sent a clear message to the men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. She checked her weapons, loaded her rifle again, and moved toward the edge of the ridge, her steps swift and deliberate. She would go after the rest of them. They were out there, waiting. They hadn't seen her yet, but she knew it wouldn't be long before they came looking for their missing comrades. Clara wasn't going to give them that chance. She wasn't going to let them take anything from her, not after everything she had worked for. She moved fast, staying low and using the storm as cover, her rifle raised and her senses sharp. Every step was calculated. She knew the land. She knew how to navigate the thick snow, how to stay hidden even in the worst of weather. The first figure came into view, another bandit, standing at the edge of the ridge, scanning the land for signs of movement. Clara didn't hesitate. She aimed, steadying herself for the shot. She squeezed the trigger. Another one down. The bandit crumpled to the ground, a sudden gasp of air escaping his lips as he fell. Clara didn't give him the satisfaction of watching his body hit the snow. She was already moving, her boots crunching lightly against the frozen earth as she advanced toward the next target. She could feel the storm building in intensity, the wind biting into her skin, but the fury in her chest was colder still. There was no room for mistakes now. There were only a few men left, and Clara knew that if they realized she had picked them off one by one, they'd regroup, retreat, and strike back with force. She couldn't let them. She couldn't let them get away to make another attempt on her life, on her land. Clara crouched low, using the ridge as cover as she made her way through the snow toward the next bandit. The storm was thickening, the visibility growing worse with each passing minute, but that worked in her favor. The bandit she was tracking hadn't seen her yet. He was standing still, scanning the horizon, looking for his fallen comrades. Clara's breath was steady, her rifle trained on his figure. She didn't wait long. As soon as the man turned slightly, giving her a clear shot, Clara squeezed the trigger. The crack of gunfire was sharp, but the storm swallowed the sound immediately, leaving only the eerie, unsettling silence that followed. The bandit's body jerked backward with the impact, and he collapsed into the snow, his rifle falling from his hands, his body disappearing into the white expanse. Clara didn't relax. She didn't allow herself the luxury of letting her guard down. The other bandits would be closing in by now. Realizing that their comrades had been taken out, one by one, they would want to take her down for good, to finish what they had started. And that thought made Clara's resolve even harder. She pulled herself up, moving fast as she disappeared deeper into the trees. She was becoming a shadow herself, a figure as much a part of the storm as the trees and the snow. The remaining men, whoever they were, wouldn't be expecting her to strike now. She had made herself invisible to them. The storm was a veil now, masking her every move, and Clara used it to her advantage. The trees creaked above her, their branches heavy with snow, but there was no sound from the men. They were out there, but they were starting to panic. Clara could feel it, the fear rippling through the snow-covered woods, the way the men moved with less coordination than before, looking for her blindly in the white expanse. She could hear them now. 2, maybe 3 of them, cursing and yelling in frustration, looking for the tracks they knew had to be there but couldn't find. "Damn it," one of them muttered, his voice muffled by the wind. "She's got to be out here. We can't let her get away." Clara's eyes narrowed. This was it. They had no idea what they were walking into. She had one chance. One shot. The first man appeared, walking through the snow, his rifle held close, moving carefully, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of her. Clara didn't wait for him to see her. She had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of a fair fight. She took a deep breath, steadied her rifle, and fired. The shot was true. The bandit's head snapped back as the bullet hit him square between the eyes, and he fell forward, his body folding into the snow without a sound. He didn't even have time to scream. He was gone before he knew what hit him. Clara didn't pause to watch him fall. She was already moving, silently, her boots barely making a sound in the snow. The others would hear the shot and come running, but Clara was already 3 steps ahead. She moved farther into the trees, staying low, keeping her rifle ready. Her breath came quicker now, but her mind was calm. She knew they were near. She could hear them now, a couple of voices, low and urgent, calling to each other as they searched for her. They were scared. and fear made men sloppy. It made them make mistakes. Another step forward, another soft crunch of snow beneath her boots. She crouched behind a thick trunk, staying out of sight. A few yards ahead, the remaining two bandits moved in tandem, one of them holding his rifle up, scanning the snow for tracks. The other was closer to her, and Clara could feel her heartbeat in her ears as she readied herself. They were within range. The first shot rang out. One of the men dropped, a bullet catching him in the throat. He gasped, clutching at his neck, but the blood spilled out quickly, and the man collapsed into the snow, a ragged, shallow breath his last. The second bandit turned, instinctively raising his rifle, but Clara was faster. She had already adjusted her aim, and with one more pull of the trigger, the man fell, the impact knocking him backward into the snow. His rifle hit the ground with a soft thud, his body crumpling beside his fallen comrade. Clara stood up slowly, moving toward the bodies. They were all dead now, every single one of them. No more threats. But she wasn't done. Not yet. There were always others. There were always more. She moved toward the tree line, scanning the area for any sign of more movement, any indication that there were more men lying in wait. But the snow was heavy now, the storm had picked up, and the remaining silence in the woods seemed louder than the sound of the shots. She had done it. She had taken down every last one of them. But Clara wasn't going to stick around to celebrate. This was the frontier. There would always be someone else who wanted to take what you had. And Clara knew that her name would be whispered in fear for a reason. She had earned it, and she had made sure of it. With her rifle slung over her shoulder and her revolver at her side, Clara turned back toward the cabin. She had survived this battle, but she knew better than to think she was safe. Not for long. The storm was still raging, but Clara knew she would face whatever came next with the same quiet resolve. No one would take Blackwood Ridge from her, not while she still had a breath in her body. Clara walked back toward her cabin, her boots crunching in the snow, each step slow but purposeful. The wind howled around her, the cold creeping into her bones, but she didn't feel it. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a hollow quiet inside her that settled like dust. It wasn't over. She knew that. The land she fought for was never truly hers to keep. Not without more blood, more battles. The snow had begun to blanket everything in thick, muffled silence again. The world outside seemed far away, distant and indifferent, just as it had always been. Clara had long ago come to terms with the unforgiving nature of the frontier. Here, on Blackwood Ridge, survival was all that mattered. She reached the cabin, the door still cracked slightly from when she had opened it earlier, and stepped inside, her movements fluid, her mind sharp. The warmth of the fire was a welcome relief from the cold, the flames dancing in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. But the comfort was fleeting. There was no peace after a fight like that. Not for her. Clara closed the door behind her, bolting it securely before moving to the table where the remnants of her earlier preparations lay. Ammunition, a few tools, the remains of the bandits' weapons she had gathered. She didn't stop to rest, didn't let herself relax. She had to stay vigilant. The thought of the bodies outside in the snow was enough to keep her moving. She couldn't afford to waste any time. Her eyes flicked toward the small window, still dark with the settling storm. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch with the firelight, the wood creaking gently as if the house itself was taking a deep, quiet breath. Clara felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the fire. There was something unsettling about this kind of silence. It was the kind that came after violence, when the world seemed to hold its breath before deciding what came next. She turned her attention back to the window, pulling the curtains tighter, making sure no hint of light escaped into the wilderness beyond. If any other bandits had survived the earlier encounter, they would be watching, waiting for a slip-up. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Clara moved to the back of the cabin, where she kept the stored supplies, dried food, blankets, and more ammunition. The storm outside was only going to get worse, and while she had enough to last a while, she wasn't one to sit idle. If the bandits didn't return, the storm itself could be just as dangerous. Her fingers traced the edges of the dried meats, the sacks of grain, the tools that had been left behind by her late husband. Thomas had been a man of quiet strength, much like her. They had fought side by side, carving out a life in the unforgiving terrain of Blackwood Ridge, and when he was gone, Clara had continued the fight alone. She had been prepared for it. It was all she knew. But tonight, there was a weight to her solitude. The fire crackled behind her as she checked the last few boxes. She had what she needed, but the reality still gnawed at her. She had taken out 4 men today, for lives, and while they had been intent on taking everything from her, it still weighed heavy. Clara had killed before, and she would kill again if it came to it. But each death left its mark. It always did. Her fingers paused over a small, leather-bound journal on the table, the one Thomas had kept. She hadn't opened it since the day he died. The storm outside raged louder now, and Clara felt a pang in her chest, a sharp reminder of the loneliness that had become part of her life. She could almost hear Thomas's voice, soft and steady, reminding her to keep her eyes on the land, to never lose sight of the survival they had worked for. But now, in this quiet cabin, surrounded by the bodies of the men who had tried to take what was hers, the silence was suffocating. Clara opened the journal slowly, as if hesitant to disturb the memories, the words written by her husband's hand. The pages were yellowed with age, but the ink was still clear. She ran her fingers over the words, the familiar loops of his handwriting grounding her. This was the last piece of him, the last piece of the life they had built together. She closed the journal with a soft sigh and placed it back on the table. There was no time for reminiscing. The storm outside would not wait for her to mourn, and neither would the men who would come next. She had survived one battle today, but there would be more. The land didn't allow for peace, not for her. The wind howled again, louder this time, and Clara stood, her mind sharp. She stepped back to the window, peering out through the thin slats of the shutters. The ridge was quiet, the storm sweeping across the land in thick sheets of white. There was nothing to see but the swirling snow, but she knew better than to think that silence was an invitation for peace. The first body had already begun to stiffen in the cold, the blood congealing in the snow. The second man would be similarly forgotten by the time the storm passed. But Clara would remember them. She would remember their faces, their last breaths. It was the price she paid for her survival. And as the night grew deeper, as the storm lashed at her cabin, Clara Reeves, widow, gunslinger, survivor, prepared herself for whatever came next. Because out here, on Blackwood Ridge, there was only one rule. You either survive or you don't. And Clara wasn't done yet. The night was heavy with the weight of the storm. Outside, the winds howled against the cabin like an unseen force trying to tear the walls apart. Snow piled against the door, thick and relentless, and Clara could hear the occasional creak of the wood as the house strained against the storm. Inside, it was warm. The fire in the hearth crackled, its light flickering in the darkness, casting long shadows across the room. But despite the warmth, Clara felt chilled. The silence after the battle was like a vacuum, pulling everything into it. She had killed 4 men today, and although she had won, there was no joy in it. In the quiet of the cabin, with the weight of the storm outside, it felt like there had been no victory at all. Clara glanced out the window once more, her eyes scanning the snowy horizon, but there was nothing to see. The storm was so thick that even the faintest shadows disappeared into the blinding whiteness. She knew they would be coming back, though. They had to. The ridge wasn't just any stretch of land. It was valuable, and Clara wasn't naive. Bandits like the ones who had attacked her didn't take kindly to losing. They would regroup, and they would send more men, or worse, someone who was even more dangerous. She didn't want to stay on the defensive. She knew from experience that waiting for trouble to find her was never the smart move. As much as she hated the idea of putting herself at risk, she knew she needed to go on the offensive. She needed to find them before they could regroup. Her mind made up, Clara gathered her rifle and revolvers, her eyes quickly scanning the room for anything she might need. She moved with purpose, each action deliberate. The storm was no longer just a cover for her. This time, it was her advantage. The snowstorm outside would make it harder for anyone to track her, just as it had done for the bandits. She slipped out the back door of the cabin, the freezing wind biting at her face as she stepped into the snow. The world was a blur of white, the visibility almost non-existent. Clara pulled the fur-lined hood of her coat up over her head and tightened the scarf around her face. She was no stranger to traveling through the snow. She had done it before, and she had learned to move with as little sound as possible. The forest around her was eerily still, the thick snow muffling her every step. But Clara's senses were sharp. She had to be. The silence in the woods was a warning. It was unnatural. She had spent enough time in this land to know when something wasn't right. The bandits had to be nearby. There was no other reason for them to be out in this kind of weather unless they were looking for something or someone. Clara crept deeper into the trees, her rifle steady in her hands, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The storm might have covered her tracks, but the bandits were likely still looking for her, using the same storm to conceal their presence. She would find them before they found her. As she moved cautiously through the trees, her thoughts shifted back to the fight earlier that day. The men she had killed weren't the first. They wouldn't be the last. But it didn't make it any easier. Clara had learned long ago that the land took from you, and it gave nothing back. You had to fight for every inch, and sometimes you had to fight harder than you thought you could. She reached the ridge line, her breath coming in shallow puffs as she took cover behind a large boulder. From here, she could see the tracks left behind by the bandits. She bent down and studied them carefully, taking in the patterns, the direction. They had gone deeper into the woods. They were following the same path, and that gave Clara an advantage. She moved swiftly, her heart steady in her chest as she followed the tracks. She had to move quickly, but she couldn't afford to make a sound. The bandits were close, and if they realized they were being followed, it would be over before it even started. Minutes stretched into hours as Clara followed the tracks through the woods. The storm seemed to grow worse with each passing minute, the wind picking up and the snow falling harder. But Clara pushed forward, her eyes never leaving the path ahead of her. She was used to the isolation, the constant vigilance. But there was something different in the air tonight. The tension was palpable, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a group of bandits. There was something about them, something that told her they weren't just out for a quick robbery. As she crept closer to a small clearing, she paused, her eyes narrowing as she saw movement ahead. A shadow in the distance. She ducked down behind the trunk of a large pine tree, holding her breath as she watched the figures move. There were 3 of them, bandits, just as she had expected. But they weren't walking aimlessly. They were talking, planning. They didn't seem to notice her approach. She waited, listening carefully to their conversation, her pulse steady despite the tension in her chest. "She's still out here," one of them said, his voice thick with irritation. "I don't know how, but she's got to be around." The others didn't come back. "She's alone," another voice responded, gruff and calculating. "She won't be able to take all of us. We hit her when she least expects it." Clara clenched her jaw, her grip tightening on her rifle. She knew they were talking about her, and she knew exactly what they planned to do next. But what they didn't know was that Clara Reeves had already decided how this fight would end. With a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the tree, her rifle aimed steady as she took in the 3 men ahead of her. They were too distracted, too certain of their own plans. They had no idea what was coming. This time, Clara wasn't waiting. She fired first. The shot rang out, sharp and quick. The first bandit didn't even have time to react. The bullet hit him square in the chest, and he crumpled instantly, falling into the snow like a rag doll. The second man, caught off guard by the sudden noise, spun around, his rifle coming up, but Clara was already on the move. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the last of them would make their mistake. Clara moved fast, her body low and swift as she closed the distance between herself and the remaining 2 men. Her rifle was still in her hands, but she didn't waste time taking another shot. Instead, she drew her revolver, the weight of it familiar in her hands. She was close now, too close for them to retaliate with any accuracy. The second bandit fired, the shot wide, missing Clara by several feet. But before he could even adjust his aim, Clara's revolver spoke again. She fired twice in quick succession. The first bullet hit him in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. The second shot caught him in the stomach, and he fell to his knees, his rifle slipping from his hands as he collapsed into the snow. Clara didn't hesitate. She turned her attention to the last man, the one who had been standing silent in the background, watching his comrades fall without a word. He raised his rifle, his eyes wide with fear, and Clara could see the hesitation in him. He was the last one, and Clara knew that the hesitation would cost him his life. She didn't give him the chance to take the first shot. Her revolver came up, and with a swift motion, she fired. The bullet struck him in the leg, just above the knee, and he went down with a scream of pain. He fell hard, his rifle clattering to the ground. But Clara didn't stop there. She had learned long ago not to take chances. She moved quickly, walking toward the man as he struggled to get to his feet, clutching at his leg. The pain was evident on his face, but Clara wasn't moved by it. He had come for her, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. "Please," the man gasped, his voice pleading. I didn't mean." Clara stopped a few feet from him, her revolver still steady in her hands. "You came looking for trouble," she said, her voice low and cold, "and now you're going to pay for it." The man's eyes darted toward the bodies of his fallen comrades, his face twisting in panic. "I don't deserve this. You deserve exactly what's coming to you," Clara interrupted, cutting him off with a sharp edge to her voice. She raised her revolver again and aimed directly between his eyes. The man didn't move. His breath came quick, shallow, and for a moment, Clara almost felt pity, but she shook it off. He had made his choice the moment he decided to come to her cabin. This was how it had to end. She squeezed the trigger. The man's body went limp, his eyes frozen in shock, and he fell backward, his arms splayed out like a broken rag doll. Clara stood there for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what she had just done. It was over. The last of the bandits was dead. They wouldn't be back. They never would. The snow around her was stained with the blood of those who had come for her, and Clara felt no relief, no satisfaction, just the quiet emptiness that followed every fight. The bodies of the men who had attacked her were now part of the land they had tried to claim. They had been ruthless, and they had underestimated her. She glanced at each of their bodies, her eyes hard, her hands still clutching the revolver. She wasn't going to leave them to be forgotten by the snow. No one who came after her, who tried to take what was hers, would go without being remembered. Clara moved from body to body, collecting their weapons and ammunition. She had already stripped the first few men of anything useful, and now she did the same for the last one. There was no sense in letting it all go to waste. Her rifle was in good condition, and it would be a while before anyone else tried to take Blackwood Ridge from her. But in the meantime, she needed to prepare. The storm raged on, the snow thickening, but Clara wasn't afraid of the cold. She had faced worse. She had survived worse. With the last of the bandits stripped of their weapons and anything of use, Clara moved back toward the cabin. The snow would soon cover the bodies, erasing the evidence of what had happened here. But Clara would know. She would always know. The storm would pass, and when it did, she would be ready for whatever came next. But for now, she needed to rest. The battle was over. She walked back into the cabin, locking the door behind her. The fire was still crackling in the hearth, its warmth a contrast to the coldness outside. Clara took a seat near the fire, her rifle resting across her lap. The storm outside would keep her isolated for a while longer, and she would use that time to gather her thoughts. There would be no more surprises tonight. No more bandits waiting in the shadows. She had taken care of them all. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of the day finally settling into her bones. She wasn't done yet. But for tonight, for this moment, there was nothing more to do but wait. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the light from the flames flickering in the dark cabin. Clara sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the orange glow, her thoughts swirling. The storm still raged outside, but the worst was over. The bandits, the ones who had come to take her land, were dead. But Clara knew that this would never truly end. It couldn't. Not in the wilderness. Not on Blackwood Ridge. She had survived the day, but survival had always been more than just staying alive. It was about fighting for what you had built. And for Clara, that meant keeping the ghosts of her past at bay, keeping the cold wind from creeping in too far. The storm outside howled louder, but Clara remained still. Her boots were covered in snow, her coat thick with the remnants of the winter storm. She had done her work, dispatched the men who had come to rob and kill her. But the silence that followed felt almost heavier than the storm. She stood up, the crack of her joints reminding her of the long hours spent in the cold, of the tension still buzzing in her veins. The fight had been hard, but she had done what needed to be done. There would be more battles, but for now, Clara could rest. She moved to the table, her gaze lingering on the small bottle of whiskey her husband had kept by the window. It was his. He had always liked to drink after a long day. Clara hadn't touched it since he died, but tonight felt like it deserved to be opened. She poured herself a drink, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light of the cabin. It was bitter, but it helped to dull the ache in her chest, the lingering discomfort of the battle, the silence of the cabin. Clara sat back down, sipping the drink slowly, savoring the burn. She didn't think about Thomas. She didn't think about the past, the life they had built together before the accident took him. She couldn't. She had learned long ago that memories, no matter how sweet, only weighed you down. Tonight, though, Clara allowed herself a brief moment of peace. The fire crackled, the whiskey warmed her insides, and for a fleeting second, the world outside seemed a little farther away. But the wind outside was relentless, and Clara knew it wouldn't be long before more trouble would come. No one stayed in this part of the world long without getting tested. The frontier didn't let you rest for long. She wasn't a fool. She knew the bandits' deaths wouldn't be the end of it. They never were. There would be others, always someone who thought they could come in and take what wasn't theirs. The storm outside intensified, the howl of the wind growing louder, but Clara wasn't afraid. The storm could rage. The snow could pile high. The world could try to bury her, but it wouldn't. Not as long as she had breath in her body. She took another long sip from her glass, then set it down on the table. The snow outside had begun to accumulate on the windowsill, but Clara knew it wouldn't be long before the storm would pass. When it did, she would have to act. She had no choice but to stay alert, no matter how much the storm raged. There was no one left to protect her but herself. The idea of being left alone had never frightened Clara. It was how she had lived for years. But tonight, the weight of the isolation felt different. The cabin, which had always been her sanctuary, now felt like a fortress. The walls she had built weren't just for the weather. They were to keep out the world, the people who would come, the people who wanted to take what wasn't theirs. But Clara knew she couldn't keep the world at bay forever. It would come for her again, just as it always did. The bandits had been one challenge. The next would be something else. Maybe it would be a lone traveler looking for shelter. Maybe it would be a gang. Or maybe it would be someone even worse. Whoever they were, they would find her. She was ready. She stood and moved to the door, her hand brushing the handle. Her fingers felt the cold of the metal, and she hesitated. The cold outside was a reminder of everything she had fought for, everything that could be taken away. But Clara wasn't going to let anyone take anything from her. Not this time. She opened the door just enough to peer outside, her breath fogging up the glass as she scanned the ridge. The storm was relentless, and the snow swirled in thick, whirling patterns, but Clara's eyes were sharp. She could make out the vague outline of the trees, the heavy, snow-laden branches bending under the weight of the snow. The world outside was a blur, but Clara could sense something in the air. Something about the way the storm felt. She didn't see anyone. No movement. Nothing. But Clara knew the world had a way of hiding its dangers. She would wait. She had to. For now, she closed the door again, bolting it tight. Clara returned to the hearth and sat down again, the fire crackling in the stillness of the cabin. The storm outside raged on, but it was no match for her resolve. She had survived the night, and she would survive whatever came next. The world outside was cold. The land was unforgiving. But Clara Reeves wasn't done yet. The storm outside howled louder than ever, the wind pounding against the cabin walls with a ferocity that seemed to mirror Clara's thoughts. She sat by the fire, her gaze flickering to the shadows that danced along the wooden walls, the crackling of the flames almost too loud in the silence of the cabin. It had been hours since the last shot had been fired, since the last of the bandits had fallen. Clara had allowed herself a few moments to gather her thoughts, to catch her breath. But she knew better than to let her guard slip. The storm might have muffled the world outside, but it didn't change the fact that danger was always just around the corner. She stood up, the heat of the fire fading against the chill of the air that crept through the cracks in the cabin. The wind had picked up, and the snow outside was coming down in sheets now, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The wilderness, once a quiet place where she could find solace, felt like a wild animal now, a beast that could turn on you at any moment. Clara moved toward the door again, her boots soft against the floorboards. She couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut, the one that told her something wasn't right. Something had shifted in the air, and the silence, despite the wind, was thick with it. The door creaked open under her touch, and she peered out into the storm. The darkness beyond the cabin stretched endlessly, the snow swirling violently as it had earlier. Clara squinted, trying to make out any shape in the darkness, but it was no use. The storm had swallowed everything. Her breath fogged up the glass, but she didn't step out yet, not until she was sure. The thought crept into her mind. Had she been too hasty? She had killed 4 men today, but Clara knew better than to assume it was over. A group like that, they had no shame. They had no real code. They would find a way to come back. It was a matter of time. She had always known that. She could feel the weight of their threat hanging in the air. The men she had killed might not have been the last. Clara's instincts told her that if anyone survived, they would be back. The wind outside howled louder, its vicious roar reminding her of the lives lost today. She didn't have time to mourn. Not now. With one last glance outside, Clara stepped away from the door. She needed to prepare. There was no more time for hesitation. The storm wouldn't stop them, and neither would she. The men out there, if they were coming, had no idea what they were about to face. She moved toward her weapons, her rifle, her revolver. She checked her ammunition, loading what she could carry and setting the rest aside. There would be no time for mistakes if the bandits came back. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. With the storm at her back, Clara knew she would need to act fast if she was going to get ahead of them. The wind might obscure their movement, but it could work to her advantage. She knew the land, the trees, the rocks, the ridge. She had lived in these woods long enough to know how to make herself invisible, how to find cover in the midst of a storm. The only question was, would they find her first? Or would she find them? Clara grabbed her coat, pulling it tight around her as she prepared to step into the storm. She moved toward the door once more, this time with purpose. The warmth of the cabin seemed far away now, a distant memory. She knew she had to make her move while the storm still gave her cover. Stepping outside, Clara braced herself against the wind. The cold bit into her skin, the snow swirling around her like a living thing, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But Clara had learned to move through storms like this one. She had learned to use the world to her advantage. She crouched low, the weight of her rifle at her side, the snow already beginning to accumulate beneath her feet. Her senses were alert, her every move calculated. The ridge was quiet, too quiet, and that was never a good sign. Clara made her way through the snow, her boots sinking slightly as she moved carefully, silently, through the thick cover of trees. The sound of her footsteps was swallowed by the storm, but she couldn't afford to assume it was enough to mask her movements. She had no way of knowing how many bandits were still out there, or if there were any at all. The ridge was covered in a thick blanket of snow, the trees standing tall and imposing, their branches heavy with the weight of the storm. Clara could feel her pulse quicken as she moved deeper into the woods, each step a deliberate motion, her senses heightened by the cold and the uncertainty. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt through her body. She wasn't afraid, but she knew better than to underestimate anything in these woods. As Clara moved through the trees, the storm began to clear slightly. She could see more clearly now, the snowflakes slowing in their descent, though the wind still bit sharply at her face. But something was off. She couldn't place it, but her gut told her she wasn't alone. She paused, listening carefully to the sounds of the woods around her. The wind still howled, but beneath it, she could hear something else, a faint rustling. She raised her rifle instinctively, her breath steady as she scanned the trees around her. The wind shifted again, and she caught the faintest glimpse of movement ahead. A shadow, just beyond the tree line. Clara didn't hesitate. She dropped to one knee, taking aim at the figure in the distance. The silhouette was moving cautiously, too cautiously, and Clara knew she had only seconds before they realized they were being watched. Without a second thought, Clara fired. The shot echoed sharply through the snow, cutting through the wind like a warning. The figure dropped, a muffled cry escaping his lips as he collapsed to the snow, his body going still. Clara didn't wait to see if there were more. She moved quickly, her rifle still in her hands, but now her instincts told her to run. She could feel the eyes of the remaining bandits on her, and this time, she wasn't going to let them get away. The storm had stopped, but Clara's fight was far from over. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she moved swiftly through the snow, her boots crunching softly underfoot. The shot she'd fired had found its mark, but she didn't take the time to savor it. She couldn't afford to. The bandits, if they weren't all dead, were still out there, and she had no intention of letting them regroup. She scanned the snow, the trees, and the ridge ahead of her, her rifle still at the ready. The storm had relented, the wind dying down and the snow beginning to settle. The heavy flakes fell lazily to the earth now, coating everything in a thick, almost peaceful blanket. But there was nothing peaceful about it. Clara could feel the tension in the air, the sense of waiting. The bandits wouldn't just let this go. If they were still alive, they'd be looking for her. She had made her move first. Now it was time to finish it. Clara's eyes narrowed as she moved further into the trees. The figure she had dropped earlier hadn't moved, but she wasn't going to let her guard slip. She couldn't. The woods were quiet now, too quiet. The wind had stilled, and the rhythmic crunch of her boots in the snow was the only sound that filled the air. Every now and then, Clara heard the faint crack of branches swaying, the occasional rustle of animals stirring in the trees. But that was it. The bandits had likely scattered by now. The one she dropped was only a scout. The rest of them could be anywhere. Clara kept moving, her mind sharp as ever. She couldn't let them circle around her. She knew these woods too well. The trees, the rocks, the hidden trails. She could move faster than they could. She had to. After a few more minutes of tense silence, Clara caught movement from the corner of her eye. She froze, her rifle coming up instinctively. Her pulse raced, but she didn't give in to the instinct to panic. No, she had to be smart. It wasn't just about taking them out one by one. It was about staying alive. A bandit emerged from behind a large tree, his face obscured by a scarf, his rifle raised. He hadn't seen her yet, and Clara's eyes narrowed as she tracked his movements. He was moving slowly, methodically. He was good, better than the others. He was the one who had led the charge earlier, the one who had planned their approach. He knew what he was doing. Clara moved quickly, ducking behind the trunk of a nearby tree. The wind had shifted, and she could smell the faint scent of his coat, the slight rustle of his movement. He wasn't alone. There had to be more nearby. She heard him mutter something under his breath, too faint for her to hear, but she could read the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped his rifle tighter as he moved forward. Clara didn't wait. She couldn't. She drew a sharp breath, her body coiled with purpose. With a single, swift motion, she leaned out from her cover and fired. The shot rang through the still air, the crack of it seeming louder than it should have been. The bandit's body jerked back, the rifle falling from his hands as he crumpled into the snow. He didn't have time to scream, didn't have time to react. Clara wasted no time. She shifted, moving toward him, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of movement. She couldn't be sure if the others had heard the shot, but she wouldn't risk waiting to find out. She approached the fallen man, checking his body quickly. He was dead. His eyes were wide with shock, but there was no mistaking it. He was done. For a moment, Clara stood over him, taking in the sight of the man who had tried to take her life. His blood stained the snow beneath him, but Clara felt no satisfaction, no peace. This was the cost of survival, and survival was the only thing that mattered in the harshness of the frontier. She turned her gaze back to the trees, her senses alert, but there was no more movement, no sound. The others must have scattered. They had to. Clara moved again, this time with more purpose. She couldn't let them circle back and pick her off from behind. The night was closing in, the storm beginning to intensify once more. She had to finish it now. As she moved through the woods, her rifle raised and ready, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something wasn't right. It was too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. She had the distinct feeling she was being watched, that the bandits weren't as far off as she had hoped. The storm had thrown everything into chaos, but now that the worst of it had passed, Clara knew better than to believe the quiet meant safety. She reached the ridge and stopped, her boots crunching on the snow as she crouched low. The ridge gave her a clear view of the area around her, and Clara took a moment to catch her breath. Her heart was steady, her mind sharp. She had handled the last of them. She could feel it in her bones. But they had a way of coming back. They always did. The sound of crunching snow reached her ears, and Clara's head snapped to the side. She was no fool. The bandits weren't done. Not yet. The figure emerged from behind a tree, one she hadn't seen before. This one was different. He was larger, his frame broader than the others, and he moved with a quiet confidence that told Clara he wasn't like the rest. He was alone, but there was something dangerous about him. Clara's fingers tightened on the rifle, her pulse quickening, but she didn't fire. Not yet. She needed to know what he was up to. She needed to know what he was waiting for. The man paused, scanning the ridge, his eyes narrowing. He had seen something. He had heard the shot. He knew someone was out there. Clara's mind raced, calculating. If she fired, he would know exactly where she was. If she waited, he might make the first move. He had to know she was close. She didn't give him the chance. In one smooth motion, Clara aimed and fired. The shot was true. He fell without a sound, his body hitting the snow with a dull thud. For a long moment, Clara stood there, rifle still raised, her breath steady, her mind racing. She didn't know if this was the last of them, but she knew this was the last fight for tonight. For this storm, Clara didn't stick around to check for others. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, the wind picking up once more. The snow was falling faster, and soon, the ridge would be swallowed by the storm again. But Clara was already a step ahead. Survival. Always. The storm howled louder than ever as Clara made her way back toward the cabin. Her boots sank into the thickening snow with each step, the world around her little more than a swirling, white blur. The trees loomed on either side, the heavy branches weighed down by the accumulation of snow, making the forest look like a ghostly labyrinth. But Clara didn't need to see the path clearly. She knew the land, the way the ridge sloped and twisted, the familiar landmarks that had been her guide for years. She felt the weight of the rifle in her hands, the comforting bulk of her revolver at her waist, and the familiar coldness that always settled in her chest after a fight. Today, she had taken the lives of men who had come to take everything she had, but now there was nothing but the lingering silence of the aftermath. She was tired, bone-deep tired, but Clara didn't stop. Not yet. The bandits might be dead, but they were only a small part of the problem. She knew that the storm, the silence that had fallen over Blackwood Ridge, was just another trick of the frontier. The land had a way of pulling you into its rhythms, of tricking you into thinking you could rest. But there would be no rest for her. Not until the world had stopped trying to take from her. By the time she reached the cabin, her breath had started to catch in the cold air. She could see the faint light of the hearth through the window, a flickering reminder of the warmth and safety within. But Clara's steps were measured, cautious. There was no guarantee that no one else was out there. The snowstorm might have masked their movements, but the land had a way of making you feel like you were always being watched. Clara moved to the door, her gloved hand resting on the cold handle for a moment before she opened it carefully, stepping inside. The familiar warmth hit her immediately, and for the briefest of seconds, Clara allowed herself to take a deep breath, to let the tension in her shoulders ease. But she didn't sit down. Not yet. She didn't even remove her coat. The cabin had always been her sanctuary, but now it felt like a cage. A place where she was waiting for the inevitable next challenge, the next fight. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the light flickering across the rough-hewn walls. The sound of the storm outside felt distant, as if the warmth and silence of the cabin were its own little world. far removed from the chaos and violence of the ridge. Clara moved to the table, her fingers brushing over the small pile of bandit weapons she had taken from the bodies earlier. Rifles, knives, and ammunition. Each one a reminder of the lives that had tried to take what was hers. She wasn't foolish enough to ignore the threat they had posed. She knew the cold, the isolation, the endless wilderness. This was a place that made men desperate, and the desperate didn't stop at anything. But Clara couldn't afford to dwell on the violence. Not for long. She moved to the window, the cold outside pressing against the glass, the storm still swirling in the distance. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon, but all she saw was the endless white, the trees bending beneath the weight of the snow. Clara's thoughts drifted back to the day, the moment she had made the decision to fight back. Her hand had shaken, only briefly, when she fired the first shot, but after that, there had been no hesitation. It had been fight or die, and she had chosen to live. But now, standing in the quiet warmth of her cabin, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. She stepped away from the window, moving to the small wooden cabinet where she kept her supplies. Her eyes flicked to the small bottle of whiskey Thomas had kept on the shelf. She hadn't touched it in years, but tonight felt like a time to remember, even if just for a moment. She poured herself a small measure, the amber liquid shimmering in the dim light. She didn't drink to forget. She drank to steel herself for what came next. The quiet was unsettling. It was the kind of silence that came after a fight, when you knew things would never be the same. And Clara knew this wasn't the end. It never was. The drink burned as it went down, the warmth spreading through her chest, but it did nothing to ease the restlessness in her mind. The bandits were gone, but the frontier had a way of drawing people like them back. She would have to stay vigilant. She would have to keep fighting, even if it meant standing alone. The door creaked. Clara's heart jumped in her chest as she reached for her revolver. Her eyes darted to the door, but then she stopped herself. It was only the wind, only the storm. The thought of the bandits had made her paranoid, but she couldn't afford to ignore anything. Not in a place like this. But the silence stretched on, and Clara was forced to acknowledge something else that gnawed at her. The storm outside was powerful, the wind howling louder than ever. It would hide her, it would give her cover, but it would also do the same for anyone else who was out there. She couldn't wait forever. The thought of the bodies outside, the men who had come to take her land, reminded Clara of the price she had paid to stay alive. There was no way to escape the frontier. It wasn't just a place, it was a way of life. It demanded everything from you, and it gave nothing back. And Clara had learned that nothing was truly hers until she fought for it, until she bled for it. But that kind of life left its mark, and the solitude that came with it made the silence louder. Clara finished her drink and set the glass down gently on the table. She could still hear the wind howling outside, but there was something else beneath it, a faint sound, barely audible over the storm. Her instincts kicked in. The door to the cabin groaned once more, the wind pushing against it. But Clara wasn't fooled by the storm's tricks. She knew better than to assume it was just the weather. Someone was out there, and they were getting closer. The wind howled outside, but Clara's senses were sharp, every nerve alive with the unmistakable feeling that something wasn't right. The storm had seemed like an ally, covering her movements, muffling the sound of her rifle fire, but now it felt like a veil hiding danger just beyond her reach. Her hand instinctively moved to the revolver at her side, fingers brushing over the cold steel, the weight familiar but unsettling. The door groaned again, and for a moment, Clara froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there. The question was, who? The storm outside had made it nearly impossible to see anything beyond the cabin, but Clara knew better than to trust the quiet. The bandits' bodies still lay scattered outside, their lives taken by her hand. But she wasn't foolish enough to think that was the end of it. If anyone survived, or if someone else had come looking for trouble, they wouldn't waste the opportunity. Clara's breath was steady as she moved toward the door, her revolver drawn. The storm had turned the world outside into a shifting white blur, but she had grown accustomed to reading the signs, to noticing the subtle shifts in the air, the quiet movements that spoke louder than the wind itself. She reached the door, and with a practiced motion, she turned the latch. For a moment, Clara held her breath, listening. The wind howled louder, but she could hear something else, a faint creaking, like boots pressing into snow. Someone was close. The door swung open with a groan, and Clara's eyes quickly scanned the snow-covered world outside, her rifle at the ready. But there was no one there. The storm obscured everything beyond a few feet, the whiteness of it all swirling in chaotic patterns, making it impossible to see clearly. Yet, something inside her told her to wait. She stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting into her skin, her breath puffing out in the chill night air. The storm wrapped around her, almost like a living thing. But Clara kept her gaze focused, scanning the trees and the ridge for movement. She knew the land, knew every shift of the wind, the way the trees stood like silent sentinels. But tonight, there was something different. Her instincts flared. A figure emerged from the storm, just at the edge of her vision. A shadow, fleeting and quick. Clara's heart raced, but her body didn't hesitate. She raised her rifle, sighting along the barrel, eyes narrowing. Whoever this was, they weren't giving her much time. "Show yourself," Clara called, her voice strong but calm, cutting through the howling wind. The figure didn't respond right away, and Clara's finger hovered near the trigger, ready for whatever came next. The figure took a step forward, a silhouette barely visible through the swirling snow. Clara's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a traveler lost in the storm. This person was coming straight toward her. And they weren't moving cautiously, they were moving with purpose. "Didn't think a woman could hold her own out here," the voice called back, rough and gruff, but with a hint of admiration. "I'm impressed, Miss Reeves." Clara's eyes widened slightly at the mention of her name. The voice sounded familiar, but there was something off about it. She had heard enough voices in this life to recognize most of the men out here. But this one was new. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, her rifle still trained on the figure, her fingers still ready to squeeze the trigger if she needed to. The storm whipped around her, but she stayed focused on the stranger. "I reckon we could trade names later," the voice called back, and the figure stepped into clearer view. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a thick scarf and a wide-brimmed hat. But Clara could see the glint of something dangerous in his eyes, something cold and calculating. "I don't trade with men who try to take from me," Clara shot back, her voice steady, unwavering. The man chuckled, low and dark. "Well, Miss Reeves, I'm not here to take from you. At least not in the way you think." Clara's grip on her rifle tightened. She didn't lower it, but she didn't fire. "Not yet." "Then what are you here for?" The man paused for a moment, a long silence hanging between them. The wind picked up again, howling louder, but Clara could feel his presence more than she could hear the storm. "I'm here because of them," he said, nodding toward the bodies Clara had left behind, scattered across the snow outside. "The men you took down earlier. You've made quite an impression, Miss Reeves, and that doesn't sit well with the rest of my boys." Clara's heart sank. She had suspected as much. She had known that killing 4 men wouldn't be the end of it, but hearing the confirmation only made the weight of it hit harder. She had drawn a line, and now it seemed like they were going to cross it. "And who are you?" Clara asked, her voice low, her eyes narrowed. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the one who finishes what my men start, and I don't take kindly to people who think they can just walk into my territory and kill my crew without facing consequences." Clara didn't flinch, but she could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just another bandit. This man was different. He was dangerous. "You've come to take what's mine, then," Clara said, her voice steady, but with an edge to it. She could feel her pulse racing. There was no going back from this. She couldn't let him think he had the upper hand. The man chuckled again, a low, unsettling sound that echoed in the storm. "No, Miss Reeves. I'm here to make you an offer. One you might not want to refuse." Clara's eyes narrowed. The man was trying to get in her head. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. But Clara wasn't in the mood to play games. "I don't make deals with people who think they can walk all over me," she said, her voice colder now. "So if you think you're going to walk away from this alive, you're mistaken." The man's smile faded slightly, but the dangerous gleam in his eyes only grew sharper. "Well, Miss Reeves, it looks like you're going to make this more difficult than it has to be." Clara didn't hesitate. Her rifle raised to her shoulder in an instant, and she fired. The shot rang out through the snowstorm, the sound sharp against the howling winds, echoing through the trees and the stillness of Blackwood Ridge. The man standing before Clara dropped without a sound, his body crumpling into the snow like the others before him. But Clara didn't lower her rifle. She didn't relax. Not yet. For a moment, everything was still. The wind howled, the snow continued to swirl in thick sheets, but Clara stood motionless, her heart beating in time with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The man she had just shot, he had looked dangerous, but Clara had faced men like him before. Men who thought they could intimidate her, control her. She wasn't afraid of them. Clara kept her eyes on the body in the snow. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Even now, she felt the tension in the air, the quiet that came before a storm, before the next attack. But the wind carried with it something else, the unmistakable sound of movement. Clara's grip tightened on her rifle as she scanned the trees, her heart rate steady despite the rising sense of danger. The man she had shot had been alone, but he had spoken of boys earlier. More of them were coming. Clara didn't know how many, but it didn't matter. She was ready. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. Movement. Several figures, slowly emerging from the storm, their shapes only just visible through the thickening snow. Clara's breath caught in her throat, but her mind stayed sharp, calculating. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They were closing in on her. The men who had come for her before, those she had already dispatched, had been part of a group. A dangerous group. But these new figures, the ones now stepping closer to her position, were more careful, more calculated. They weren't rushing in recklessly like the others had. They had learned from their mistakes. Clara knew they would take their time, move with caution, and maybe, just maybe, they would try to outflank her. She wouldn't let that happen. Without hesitation, she stepped back into the trees, her movements quick and quiet, barely a whisper against the snow-covered ground. She couldn't be seen. Not yet. She needed to get a better sense of where they were, how many of them there were. Clara crouched low behind a thick pine, her eyes scanning the movements of the men as they drew closer. They were spread out now, methodical in their approach. They weren't taking any chances. Her pulse quickened. There were 4 of them, moving slowly, carefully. 2 of them were checking the body of the man she'd shot. The others were looking around, scanning the trees, no doubt trying to figure out where she'd gone. Clara knew it was only a matter of time before they noticed something wasn't right. The bodies outside, the blood in the snow, the fact that they hadn't found her yet. Something would make them stop and reconsider their approach. But Clara wouldn't wait for them to get comfortable. She had one chance to strike before they realized she was playing the game, and she wouldn't miss. Her rifle came up, steady in her hands. She took a deep breath, her heart steady, her mind calm. She had faced down worse odds than this. She had killed men who thought they could take everything from her, and she had survived. She would survive this, too. The first man turned slightly, his back to her, and Clara took her shot. The crack of the rifle broke the silence of the woods, the bullet finding its mark in the man's back. He dropped instantly, his body jerking forward, collapsing into the snow. The others reacted instantly, but Clara was already moving. She didn't wait for them to find cover. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a fair fight. She moved fast, staying low, her rifle ready. The next man turned in her direction, and before he could raise his weapon, she fired again. The shot rang out, and the second man fell, his body crumpling as the bullet hit him square in the chest. He didn't have time to scream, didn't have time to take a shot. He was gone before he even knew what hit him. Clara didn't stop. She kept moving, her eyes scanning for the next target, her mind already calculating where the remaining 2 were. They had split up. They were trying to flank her, one moving toward the left, the other toward the right. But Clara was faster. She dropped to a knee, taking aim at the one on the left. He didn't see her coming, and when she fired, the bullet hit him clean in the neck. He staggered, gasped for air, but he didn't last long. He fell forward, his rifle clattering uselessly beside him. Only one left. Clara's pulse quickened as she stood, moving toward the last man. He was still scanning the area, still looking for her, his back to her. But Clara was already there, rifle raised, her aim steady. "Looking for me?" she called, her voice steady, cutting through the storm. The man froze, and Clara saw the flicker of realization in his eyes just before she fired. The shot rang out. The last man dropped, his body falling lifeless to the snow. Clara stood in the silence that followed, her breath coming in steady, controlled breaths. The storm had passed, the wind still howling, but the world around her was still. The bodies of the bandits lay scattered across the snow, their blood soaking into the earth they had tried to claim. Clara didn't flinch as she walked toward them, her rifle still in hand, her heart steady. The fight was over, but the cost of survival was always the same: loneliness, isolation, and the lingering weight of the lives she had taken. She didn't feel satisfaction, nor did she feel regret. She simply felt the weight of the land she fought for, the land that had claimed her husband and now claimed these men. The frontier was unforgiving, and Clara had learned long ago that you either fought or you died. She had fought, and she had won. But for how long? The storm raged on, but Clara knew the answer. It never ended. Not for her. Not on Blackwood Ridge. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.